In 1979, the world's most powerful army crossed into one of the poorest countries on earth, convinced the war would be over in weeks. Tanks rolled in, helicopters filled the sky. Moscow believed history was on its side, but Afghanistan had other plans. What followed was not just a war. It was a slow, brutal collapse of an empire, fought in mountains that swallowed armies and in villages where faith proved stronger than firepower. This is the story of how a superpower entered Afghanistan confident and left broken, changed forever. Stay with me, because what happened next reshaped global history in ways few truly understand. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In December 1979, the mountains of Afghanistan were quiet, but not at peace. Snow rested on jagged peaks that had watched empires rise and fall for centuries. These mountains had seen Alexander's armies bleed, British columns vanish, and kings crumble under their weight. They had learned patience, and once again history was about to repeat itself. From the north came steel. On the night of December 24th, Soviet transport planes cut through the Afghan sky. Paratroopers descended silently onto Kabul's airfields. Tanks rolled across the Amu Darya River. Columns of armored vehicles pressed into valleys that had never bowed to outsiders. Officially, Moscow called it assistance. Privately, it was fear. Fear of losing control, fear of collapse, fear that Afghanistan might slip from Soviet influence and expose the weakness of an empire already cracking from within. But Afghanistan was not a chessboard. It was a graveyard. The story begins years earlier in 1978, when Afghanistan's fragile balance shattered during the Soviet Revolution. A Marxist government seized power, promising progress, equality, and reform. But reforms imposed without understanding turned into violence. Land redistribution shattered tribal structures. Religious leaders were imprisoned or executed. Villages resisted, the countryside burned. The new government ruled cities, but the villages, the soul of Afghanistan, rose in defiance. By 1979, Kabul was a city of whispers and fear. President Hafizullah Amin, once a Soviet ally, had become unpredictable. Moscow no longer trusted him, and so the decision was made, one that would haunt the Soviet Union forever. On December 27, Soviet special forces stormed the Tajbek Palace. Amin was killed. Within hours, Babrak Karmal was installed as leader, flown in under Soviet protection. Afghanistan had not been consulted. Its people had not been asked. A nation woke up occupied. What followed was not a conventional war. It was a collision between an empire built on machines and a people shaped by mountains. The Red Army arrived with tanks, helicopters, artillery, and confidence. They expected resistance, but not this. Afghan fighters, soon known as the Mujahideen, did not wear uniforms. They melted into villages, climbed cliffs barefoot, and fought not for ideology, but for faith, land, and honor. To them, this was not geopolitics, this was survival. Every valley became an ambush, every road a death trap. Soviet soldiers, many barely out of their teens, found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see. Letters home spoke of confusion, fear, and disbelief. They had been told they were liberators. Instead, they were occupiers in a land that rejected them at every turn. The helicopters, Mi-24 Hind gunships, became symbols of Soviet power. They roared across valleys, firing rockets into mountain hideouts. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were bombed, crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, entire populations were displaced, and yet the resistance only grew. Afghanistan bled, but it did not break. Millions of civilians fled. Refugees poured into Pakistan and Iran, families carrying nothing but memories and grief. Children grew up in camps, knowing war as their first language. Afghanistan became one of the largest humanitarian disasters of the Cold War, though the world spoke of it in hushed tones. Meanwhile, the war quietly expanded beyond Afghanistan's borders. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and other allies funneled weapons and money to the Mujahideen. Pakistan became the war's artery. This was no longer just a Soviet-Afghan conflict. It was a Cold War battleground. One superpower bled another without firing a single official shot. In 1986, everything changed. The arrival of American-supplied Stinger missiles turned the sky against the Soviets. Helicopters that once ruled the mountains now fell in flames. Soviet air superiority, once absolute, collapsed. Morale shattered. Soldiers no longer felt untouchable. The war became unwinnable. Inside the Soviet Union, coffins returned quietly, often at night. Families were told little. Official media spoke of duty and honor, but mothers knew the truth. Afghanistan was eating their sons. Economically, the war drained a system already suffocating. Politically, it exposed the lies. Morally, it broke faith between the state and its people. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. By then, the cost was unbearable. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed back over the Friendship Bridge. No victory parade followed. No triumph was declared. Only silence and the unspoken understanding that the war had been lost. For Afghanistan, however, the nightmare was far from over. The Soviets left, but they left behind a shattered state, millions of weapons, and a generation shaped by violence. Civil war followed. Then came the rise of the Taliban. Then, decades later, another invasion, this time by the West. Afghanistan's suffering echoed forward in time, rooted in 1979. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point. The invasion exposed the limits of power, the danger of arrogance, and the cost of ignoring history. Within 2 years of withdrawal, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The empire that had marched into the mountains no longer existed. Afghanistan remained, still scarred, still standing. This is not just a story of war, it is a warning. It is the story of what happens when ideology silences humanity, when power replaces understanding, when empires forget that some lands cannot be conquered, only endured. The mountains of Afghanistan still watch. They remember every footprint, every fallen soldier, every broken promise. They wait patiently for the next empire to arrive, confident in what history has already proven. Empires leave. The mountains remain. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union stood outwardly strong but inwardly uneasy, a super power haunted by the quiet fear of losing control over its borders and its ideology. Afghanistan, a rugged neighbor on the southern edge of the Soviet sphere, became the mirror reflecting those anxieties. What Moscow feared most was not Afghanistan itself, but the possibility that instability there would spill across borders, inspire rebellion, or signal to the world that Soviet influence could be challenged and weakened. The Cold War was not only fought with missiles and armies, but with perceptions, and the Kremlin was obsessed with the image of strength. Any crack, however small, was treated as an existential threat. After the Soviet Revolution of 1978, Afghanistan's new Marxist government seemed at first like a strategic victory for the Soviet bloc. A friendly regime sat in Kabul, pledging loyalty to socialist ideals. But this victory quickly turned poisonous. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan was divided, inexperienced, and brutally disconnected from Afghan society. Its leaders attempted to reshape a deeply traditional, religious, and tribal nation through sudden decrees inspired by foreign ideology. Land reforms ignored centuries-old customs. Religious leaders were humiliated and imprisoned. Tribal elders were sidelined. What the Afghan communists saw as progress, the people experienced as an attack on their identity. From Moscow, reports arrived daily describing unrest, assassinations, and uprisings. Entire provinces slipped beyond government control. Soviet advisors on the ground warned that the Afghan army was collapsing, desertions rising, loyalty evaporating. The fear inside the Kremlin grew sharper. If the Afghan government fell, it would not just be a local failure, but a symbolic defeat in the global Cold War. The United States and its allies were watching closely. To Soviet leaders, allowing a socialist ally to collapse looked dangerously close to admitting weakness. The paranoia was amplified by geography. Afghanistan shared a long border with Soviet Central Asia, a region populated by Muslim communities already viewed with suspicion by Moscow. Soviet leaders feared that Islamic resistance in Afghanistan could ignite religious or nationalist movements inside their own republics. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 had already sent shockwaves through the region, proving that a powerful Western-backed regime could fall to religious uprising. To the aging men in the Kremlin, the world felt increasingly unpredictable, and unpredictability was the enemy of control. At the heart of the decision-making process was the belief that intervention could be quick, decisive, and limited. Soviet planners convinced themselves that a short deployment of troops would stabilize the Afghan government, remove unreliable leaders, and restore order. They believed their presence would intimidate rebels into submission and reassure allies of Soviet resolve. This belief was rooted in decades of centralized thinking, where dissent was assumed to crumble under sufficient force. Afghanistan was misread as a weak state rather than a complex society shaped by centuries of resistance to outsiders. The figure of Hafizullah Amin intensified these fears. Once supported by Moscow, Amin increasingly appeared independent, volatile, and uncontrollable. Soviet intelligence suspected him of secret contacts with the West, though evidence was thin, outed by Cold War paranoia. More alarming was his brutality, which fueled rebellion rather than suppressing it. To Soviet leaders, Amin represented chaos, and chaos near the border was unacceptable. Removing him became a priority framed not as aggression, but as damage control. Inside the Politburo, the invasion was not debated as a moral question, but as a strategic necessity. The language used was clinical, stabilization, assistance, international duty. Afghanistan was reduced to a problem to be solved. Very few voices questioned whether foreign troops could ever impose legitimacy on a government rejected by its own people. Fewer still considered the human cost. The Soviet system rewarded loyalty and conformity, not doubt. Once the momentum toward intervention began, reversing it became nearly impossible. Cold War logic also played its role. The United States had intervened in Vietnam, Latin America, and elsewhere to protect its interests. Soviet leaders believed they were playing by the same rules, that global power demanded decisive action. Not acting, in their eyes, would embolden enemies and weaken allies. Afghanistan was framed as a test of credibility. If the Soviet Union hesitated, what message would that send to Eastern Europe, to allied regimes, to revolutionary movements across the world? Yet beneath this confidence lay insecurity. The Soviet economy was stagnating. Its political leadership was aging. The system struggled to inspire belief even among its own citizens. Afghanistan became a stage upon which Moscow tried to reaffirm its relevance and strength, not realizing that the very act of invasion would expose its limitations. The assumption that why power could compensate for political failure was a dangerous illusion, but one deeply ingrained in Soviet strategic culture. When the final decision was made in December 1979, it was presented as inevitable. Soviet media spoke of fraternal assistance, of protecting socialism from foreign interference. The language masked the truth. The invasion was driven less by Afghan realities and more by Soviet fears. Fear of losing influence, fear of ideological collapse, fear of appearing weak in a world divided into hostile camps. As Soviet troops crossed the border, they carried with them the full weight of Cold War calculations, historical misjudgments, and institutional arrogance. They entered Afghanistan believing they were securing the future, unaware that they were stepping into a conflict that would drain their strength, fracture their legitimacy, and accelerate the decline they were so desperately trying to prevent. The invasion was not born from confidence, but from anxiety, and it was that anxiety disguised as strategy that pushed an empire into a war it could not control. Afghanistan was never an empty land waiting to be shaped by ideology. It was a living tapestry of faith, tribe, memory, and honor, woven together over centuries of survival. Long before Soviet tanks crossed its borders, Afghans had learned to define themselves through resistance, not conquest. Loyalty was not given to distant capitals or abstract political systems, but to family, clan, village, and religion. When an outside force attempted to impose change without consent, it was not seen as reform, but as an assault on identity itself. Religion lay at the center of this resistance. Islam in Afghanistan was not merely a belief system, it was the moral backbone of daily life, guiding law, custom, and social order. The communist reforms introduced after the 1978 revolution struck directly at this foundation. Mosques were monitored, religious schools shut down, and clerics imprisoned or executed. To the rural population, these actions confirmed their worst fears that the state had declared war on their faith. When Soviet troops arrived to support this government, they were instantly associated with this spiritual violation, regardless of their individual intentions. Tribal structure further deepened the resistance. Afghanistan was not a unified nation-state in the Western sense, but a mosaic of tribes and ethnic groups, each with its own leadership, rivalries, and codes of honor. Authority flowed upward from elders, not downward from bureaucrats. The Soviet-backed government tried to bypass these structures, replacing them with centralized control and party loyalty. This move shattered local balances of power and triggered rebellion, even among those who had little interest in global politics. Resistance was not organized because of ideology alone. It was organized because local autonomy had been threatened. Honor, or nang, was inseparable from Afghan identity. The presence of foreign soldiers on Afghan soil was seen as humiliation, not just occupation. Stories of house searches, accidental civilian deaths, and cultural misunderstandings spread rapidly from village to village, magnified by memory and oral tradition. Each incident added fuel to a growing sense of collective duty. To fight was not simply an option, it became an obligation passed from father to son, brother to brother. Neutrality was viewed as weakness, collaboration as betrayal. The geography of Afghanistan shaped this resistance as much as culture did. Mountains, deserts, and narrow valleys had protected Afghan communities for generations. These landscapes favored those who knew them intimately and punished those who did not. Villages were connected by footpaths, invisible to outsiders. Fighters could disappear into terrain that Soviet maps barely understood. The land itself became an ally, reinforcing the belief that God and nature stood on the side of those defending their homes. Resistance was decentralized, fluid, and deeply personal. There was no single command, no unified army in the early years. Fighters gathered around charismatic leaders, religious figures, or respected elders. Decisions were made locally, based on immediate needs rather than long-term strategy. This fragmentation confused Soviet planners, who were trained to fight hierarchical armies. Every victory seemed temporary. Every cleared area reoccupied once troops withdrew. The absence of a central authority made the resistance resilient, impossible to decapitate. The concept of jihad gave spiritual meaning to the struggle. It transformed resistance into sacred duty, framing the war as a defense of Islam against godless invaders. This narrative resonated deeply in a society where faith defined justice and legitimacy. Young men joined not for pay or politics, but for salvation, honor, and the promise that their suffering had divine purpose. Death was no longer defeat. It was martyrdom. This belief altered the psychological balance of the war, creating fighters willing to endure losses that a conventional army could not sustain. Family and community networks sustained the resistance. Women cooked, carried messages, hid weapons, and cared for the wounded. Children acted as lookouts. Entire villages became logistical hubs, offering shelter and intelligence. The line between civilian and fighter blurred, not because of coercion, but because survival demanded unity. When one family suffered, others followed. Grief became collective, and collective grief hardened into resolve. External support amplified these internal dynamics, but did not create them. Weapons and money flowed in from abroad, yet the will to fight was already deeply rooted. The resistance drew strength from shared history, from stories of past invaders who had failed to conquer Afghanistan. These stories were not academic lessons. They were living memories passed down through generations. Each Soviet convoy destroyed was seen not as a tactical win, but as confirmation that history was repeating itself. Attempts by the Soviet-backed government to win hearts and minds failed because they misunderstood the source of loyalty. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure could not compensate for the loss of dignity felt by communities under occupation. Promises of modernization rang hollow when delivered at gunpoint. Every reform was overshadowed by the presence of foreign troops, and every act of violence, intentional or not, reinforced the belief that resistance was the only path left. Over time, the resistance reshaped Afghan society itself. War became a way of life, normalizing violence and hardening attitudes. Children grew up with weapons in their hands and loss in their hearts. Tribal and religious entities, once balanced by local customs, grew sharper under the pressure of conflict. The unity forged in resistance was powerful, but it also carried seeds of future division as rival factions competed for influence and resources. The Soviet Union faced not just an armed opposition, but a society mobilized by belief, memory, and survival instinct. Every attempt to impose control collided with values that could not be bombed into submission or negotiated away. The war revealed a fundamental truth, that power measured in tanks and aircraft meant little against a people fighting to defend who they were. Afghanistan resisted not because it was strong in conventional terms, but because its identity left no space for surrender. When the Red Army entered Afghanistan, it carried with it the full confidence of a modern military machine shaped by decades of doctrine, discipline, and technological superiority. Soviet strategy was built for large-scale warfare on the plains of Europe, for clashes between armored divisions and mechanized infantry supported by overwhelming firepower. Afghanistan was expected to be another theater where this strength would assert itself. Instead, it became a landscape that stripped away every advantage the Red Army believed it possessed. Soviet forces relied heavily on tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery to dominate territory. On paper, the imbalance was staggering. The Mujahideen were lightly armed, often using outdated rifles and improvised explosives. Yet the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan transformed this imbalance into a liability. Narrow roads forced Soviet convoys into predictable routes. Steep terrain limited the movement of heavy armor. Every pass became a choke point, every bridge a potential ambush. The Red Army's strength turned into a vulnerability as mobility vanished and surprise shifted to the defenders. Guerrilla warfare thrived in this environment. Mujahideen fighters avoided direct confrontation, striking instead with speed and precision. They attacked supply lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and withdrew before Soviet units could respond effectively. A single mine buried beneath a road could halt an entire column for hours, sometimes days. While Soviet doctrine emphasized holding ground, the resistance cared little for territory. Victory was measured in exhaustion inflicted, not land controlled. Air power initially gave the Soviets an overwhelming edge. Helicopters and fighter jets allowed rapid troop deployment and devastating strikes on suspected rebel positions. Villages were bombed to deny shelter to fighters, and valleys were saturated with firepower in search of elusive targets. Yet this reliance on air superiority revealed a deeper weakness. Bombing campaigns often failed to distinguish between combatants and civilians, pushing neutral populations into the arms of the resistance. Each airstrike that destroyed a home or killed a family member became a recruitment tool for the Mujahideen. Soviet soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed invisible. Fighters blended seamlessly into civilian life, laying down weapons and disappearing among villagers moments after an attack. The inability to identify the enemy bred paranoia. Patrols grew tense. Checkpoints became aggressive. Trust between soldiers and civilians collapsed entirely. This psychological strain wore down morale far faster than casualties alone ever could. The Red Army attempted to adapt. Specialized units were trained for mountain warfare. New tactics emphasized search and destroy missions, airborne assaults, and the use of local militias. Yet these adaptations were reactive, not transformative. Soviet command structures remained rigid, slow to respond, and disconnected from realities on the ground. Orders traveled through layers of bureaucracy, often arriving too late to matter. By contrast, Mujahideen commanders operated independently, adjusting plans within minutes based on terrain, weather, or opportunity. Supply became one of the war's greatest challenges. Soviet troops depended on long, vulnerable supply lines stretching from bases in the north to isolated outposts in the south and east. Fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts all had to travel through hostile territory. Attacks on supply convoys were frequent and devastating. Even when not destroyed, delays crippled operations. A modern army designed for sustained logistical support struggled to function when that support was constantly under threat. The Mujahideen turned simplicity into strength. They carried only what they needed, relied on local resources, and moved light and fast. Weapons were shared, reused, and captured from the enemy. Knowledge of the land allowed them to choose when and where to fight. Time favored them. Every month the war dragged on drained Soviet resources while resistance fighters measured endurance in generations, not campaigns. Training and morale diverged sharply between the two sides. Soviet soldiers were often conscripts with limited understanding of why they were fighting. Many arrived in Afghanistan believing official propaganda about international duty, only to confront hostility and isolation. Letters home spoke of confusion, fear, and disillusionment. Alcohol and drug use rose. Discipline weakened. The sense of purpose that sustained soldiers in war slowly eroded. For the Mujahideen, motivation was deeply personal. Fighters were defending their homes, families, and faith. Losses, though painful, reinforced commitment rather than diminishing it. Death was framed as martyrdom, suffering as sacrifice. This psychological resilience offset material inferiority. A fighter who believed he was fighting for survival and honor could endure conditions that broke professional soldiers fighting for abstract goals. The introduction of advanced weapons to the resistance marked a turning point, but it did not create the imbalance, it exposed it. When surface-to-air missiles began downing Soviet helicopters, The symbolic impact was immense. Aircraft that once dominated the battlefield became targets. Pilots flew higher, less accurately, reducing effectiveness. The sky, once a shield, became another source of fear. The Red Army lost not only machines, but confidence. Despite overwhelming firepower, the Soviets never fully controlled the countryside. Cities and major roads remained under their influence, but beyond them lay a hostile landscape where authority dissolved. Each attempt to pacify rural areas required massive force and yielded only temporary results. Once troops withdrew, resistance returned. The war became a cycle of advance, destruction, and retreat with no lasting gains. The clash between modern military doctrine and guerrilla war fare revealed a fundamental mismatch. The Red Army was designed to defeat armies, not movements. It could seize ground, but not loyalty. It could destroy infrastructure, but not belief. Every metric of success used by Soviet planners failed to capture the reality of the conflict. Kill counts and territory held meant little against an enemy that did not measure victory the same way. As years passed, the technological advantage of the Soviet Union became irrelevant in the face of adaptability, motivation, and local knowledge. The war demonstrated that superior firepower could be neutralized by patience, terrain, and a population willing to endure unimaginable hardship. Afghanistan did not defeat the Red Army by matching its strength, but by rendering that strength ineffective in a war that refused to follow the rules of conventional combat. War in Afghanistan was not confined to battlefields or front lines. It seeped into homes, fields, and memories, transforming everyday life into a struggle for survival. When Soviet forces entered the country, the true weight of the conflict fell not only on soldiers, but on civilians who had no shelter from the violence unfolding around them. Villages that had existed for generations became targets, caught between occupation forces and resistance fighters, punished for loyalties they often did not choose. Bombardment became a constant presence. Airstrikes and artillery fire aimed at suspected rebel hideouts frequently struck civilian areas. Houses built of mud and stone collapsed under explosions. Wells were destroyed, crops burned, livestock killed. For rural families dependent on the land, these losses meant starvation as much as destruction. Entire communities were forced to abandon ancestral homes, leaving behind graves, orchards, and histories that could not be carried away. Fear reshaped daily life. The sound of helicopters overhead sent families scrambling for cover. Children learned to distinguish the whistle of incoming fire before they learned to read. Nights were spent in silence, lights extinguished. As villagers listened for footsteps or engines, any encounter could turn deadly. A wrong glance at a checkpoint, a misunderstood gesture, or a rumor of collaboration could result in arrest, beating, or death. The displacement that followed was massive and relentless. Millions of Afghans fled their homes, forming one of the largest refugee populations in the world at the time. Families walked for days across mountains and deserts, carrying what little they could. The elderly collapsed along the way. Children fell ill from hunger and exposure. Borders offered no safety, only uncertainty. Refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran overflowed with people who had lost not just homes, but livelihoods and identity. Life in the camps was survival stripped to its bare essentials. Tents replaced houses. Food was rationed. Disease spread easily. Education, healthcare, and opportunity vanished almost overnight. Generations grew up knowing nothing but exile. For many children, the memory of Afghanistan became a story told by parents, fading with time. The war did not simply displace people geographically, it displaced them from their past and their future. Women carried a unique burden. They became heads of households as men were killed, imprisoned, or drawn into fighting. They cared for wounded relatives, raised children in impossible conditions, and navigated a world where safety was never guaranteed. Grief became routine. Mothers buried sons, Wives waited for husbands who never returned. Their suffering rarely appeared in official accounts, yet it formed the emotional core of the war's devastation. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical destruction. Trauma embedded itself into the collective consciousness. Constant exposure to violence normalized fear and loss. Children who witnessed death daily grew up without a sense of peace. Trust eroded within communities as survival demanded caution. Accusations of collaboration or betrayal fractured social bonds that had once held villages together. Economic collapse followed close behind. Markets were destroyed. Trade routes became battlegrounds. Fields lay fallow as farmers fled or were killed. Livelihoods that had sustained families for generations vanished. Dependency on aid increased, not because people lacked skill or will, but because war erased the foundations of self-sufficiency. Poverty deepened, and with it, vulnerability to exploitation and recruitment into armed groups. The environment itself suffered. Forests were cut down for fuel by displaced populations. Landmines contaminated fields and pathways, rendering vast areas unusable. Even after battles ended, the ground remained deadly. Children lost limbs while playing. Farmers were killed returning to their land. The war continued to claim victims long after the fighting moved elsewhere. Civilian suffering became a strategic factor rather than a tragic byproduct. Villages suspected of supporting resistance were collectively punished. Fear was used as a tool of control. Yet these measures backfired, hardening resistance and ensuring that grief translated into anger rather than submission. Each destroyed village produced not compliance, but a deeper sense of injustice passed from one generation to the next. The refugee crisis altered the social fabric of the region. Host countries struggled to absorb millions of displaced people, straining resources and infrastructure. Refugee camps became political spaces, recruitment grounds, and centers of radicalization. Children educated in exile absorbed narratives shaped by loss and resentment. The war's impact spread beyond Afghanistan's borders, destabilizing neighboring regions and entangling new actors in its consequences. Humanitarian aid, while essential, could not heal the wounds inflicted by years of violence. Food and shelter addressed immediate needs, but not trauma or displacement of identity. International attention came and went, often driven by geopolitical interests rather than human suffering. Afghans learned that their pain was visible only when it served someone else's agenda. By the time Soviet troops withdrew, the damage was irreversible. Entire regions lay empty. Families were scattered across borders. A generation had grown up knowing only war. The absence of peace was no longer shocking, it was expected. The human cost of the conflict could not be measured in statistics alone, but in lost childhoods, broken families, and a society forced to adapt to continuous loss, carrying wounds that would shape Afghanistan long after the last foreign soldier had gone. The war in Afghanistan did not end at the Soviet border. It followed the Red Army home, embedding itself into the political, economic, and moral foundations of the Soviet Union. What began as a limited intervention slowly transformed into a prolonged conflict that exposed the weaknesses of a system built on control, secrecy, and the illusion of invincibility. Afghanistan became a mirror in which the Soviet state saw its own decline reflected back with painful clarity. From the beginning, the war strained an already fragile economy. Sustaining a distant conflict required massive resources, fuel, ammunition, equipment, and manpower. Billions of rubles were poured into a war that produced no tangible benefit for ordinary citizens. Factories diverted production to military needs, while consumer goods grew scarce. The economic promises of socialism rang increasingly hollow as living standards stagnated. Afghanistan became a symbol of waste, a place where national wealth disappeared without explanation or reward. The human cost deepened this crisis of faith. Young men were conscripted and sent south with little understanding of where they were going or why. Casualties were hidden from public view, returned in sealed coffins under strict instructions for silence. Families were told not to ask questions. Funerals were quiet, almost secret. This culture of concealment eroded trust between the state and its people. Rumors spread faster than official statements, and the truth, once glimpsed, proved more damaging than any enemy propaganda. Veterans' return changed. Many carried physical wounds, many more carried psychological scars. They came back to a society unprepared to acknowledge their experiences. Official narratives spoke of heroism and duty, but offered little support or recognition. Alcoholism, depression, and alienation became common among those who had fought. These men, once symbols of Soviet strength, became living reminders of a war no one wanted to discuss. Politically, Afghanistan shattered the myth of Soviet military superiority. The Red Army, long portrayed as an unstoppable force, had failed to defeat a decentralized resistance. This failure resonated far beyond Afghanistan. Allies began to question Moscow's reliability. Opponents sensed vulnerability. Within the Warsaw Pact and beyond, the image of Soviet power lost its aura of inevitability. The war demonstrated that the state could no longer impose its will through force alone. The invasion also accelerated internal debate and dissent. Intellectuals, writers, and even party members began questioning the purpose of the war and the system that produced it. Though censorship remained, cracks appeared in the narrative. By the mid-1980s, criticism grew harder to suppress. Afghanistan became a focal point for broader frustrations about corruption, stagnation, and the lack of political openness. The war did not create these problems, but it made them impossible to ignore. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, he inherited a conflict that symbolized everything that needed to change. His policies of glasnost and perestroika were driven in part by the recognition that the Soviet Union could no longer afford wars of control. Afghanistan was labeled a bleeding wound, an acknowledgement that the cost was unsustainable. The decision to withdraw was not simply military. It was an admission that the old methods of governance had failed. The withdrawal itself was marked by restraint rather than celebration. There was no victory to declare, no success to display. The image of Soviet soldiers crossing the Friendship Bridge in 1989 carried a quiet finality. The war ended not with triumph but with exhaustion. For many citizens, it confirmed what they had long suspected: the state was no longer capable of delivering on its promises. Globally, the consequences were profound. A conflict altered the balance of the Cold War, proving that superpower intervention could be resisted by determined local forces. It reshaped military thinking, emphasizing the limits of conventional power against insurgencies. It emboldened movements around the world, while simultaneously encouraging the United States and its allies to pursue proxy warfare rather than direct confrontation. The war also contributed to the unraveling of the Soviet political system itself. The economic strain, loss of legitimacy, and growing public skepticism created a climate in which reform became unavoidable. Afghanistan did not single-handedly destroy the Soviet Union, but it accelerated processes already underway. Within 2 years of withdrawal, the USSR ceased to exist. The empire that had marched into Kabul dissolved under the weight of its contradictions. For Afghanistan, the legacy was equally devastating, but far less discussed. The power vacuum left behind ignited civil war, paving the way for extremist movements and decades of instability. Weapons, fighters, and ideologies cultivated during the conflict did not disappear. They evolved. The war's global ripple effects extended into future conflicts, shaping security policies and interventions. For generations, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan stands as a turning point in modern history, not because of a single battle or decision, but because it revealed the consequences of imposing power without legitimacy. It demonstrated how fear-driven policy can entangle a state in conflicts that undermine its own survival. The war changed Afghanistan forever, but it also changed the world, marking the moment when a superpower learned that even vast strength can be undone by a war it never truly understood. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe